September 1945, Hawaii. The war was over, but the wires still held. Behind the fences of a POW camp, Japanese women woke to a smell they did not know. It was not rice steaming, not barley soup, not the broth of home. It was darker, sharper, the air cut with bitterness that seemed more like smoke than food. Keiko, 22, sat up on her bunk, her hair cropped short, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. She sniffed once, wrinkled her nose, and whispered to the woman beside her, "Kusuri? Medicine?" The word passed down the row like current through wire. Medicine. The liquid in the air smelled closer to poison than breakfast. Boots crunched on gravel outside. Guards pushed through the door, carrying heavy metal pitchers. Steam rose in white columns. Tin cups clinked as they were set down on the tables. The liquid poured was black as ink, glimmering with oil on top. For the women, it was the first time their eyes had truly seen coffee. And to them, it was not food. It was punishment. In Japan, before the war, coffee was rumor. In Yokohama or Kobe, wealthy families sometimes sipped it in porcelain cups, treating it like a rare tonic. Doctors prescribed it in tiny doses, calling it a stimulant for the weak or the sleepless. For common people, it was invisible, unknown. To Keiko, the sight looked dangerous. She remembered her father dipping brushes into black ink before writing characters. The surface of the cup looked no different. A dark pool that could stain, could burn. The guard chuckled as he lifted his own mug. "Coffee," he said slowly, pointing, then drank in one swallow. The gesture only deepened the confusion. Why would a soldier drink medicine like water? Keiko lifted the cup to her lips. The steam stung her nose. She braced herself, the way one braces for quinine pills or bitter herbs in a fever. She sipped. The taste struck like a whip. Bitterness exploded across her tongue, harsher than any tea, sharper than any medicine she had ever taken. She gagged, coughed, nearly spilled the cup. Around her, women sputtered, laughed nervously at their own shock. To them, the Americans had not given a drink. They had given a test. The guard shook his head, smiling. From a tin canister, he poured white grains into his own mug and stirred. Sugar. He raised it again, took a sip, and sighed. The women watched, puzzled. In their world, medicine was never sweet. Most pushed the cups aside, hiding them under the bunks. Some whispered that the drink was poison. Others muttered it was punishment. Suspicion grew quickly in the damp air. The irony cut deep. The Americans had meant kindness. To them, coffee was daily fuel. To the prisoners, it was fear in liquid form. Outside the barracks, gallons of coffee disappeared every hour. For the U.S. Army, it was as vital as ammunition. Generals called it indispensable. A logistics officer had once calculated over 140,000 tons shipped during the war. Enough beans to fill freight trains from New York to Chicago. But Keiko did not know numbers. She only knew the aftertaste on her tongue. Sharp, alien, unforgettable. To her, coffee belonged to sickness, not to life. And yet, that first sip would become the beginning of something stranger. What seemed like poison would turn, with sugar, into revelation. What seemed like punishment would explain a nation's victory. The second morning began almost the same as the first. The same boots on gravel, the same clang of doors, the same steam that pushed into the barracks even before the guards entered. But something in the air was different. The women remembered. Their tongues still carried the ghost of yesterday's bitterness. Even in sleep, some had gagged at the memory. Even awake, the thought of that black liquid made their stomachs tighten. Keiko sat upright before the door opened. She smelled it first. That sharp, acrid wave rolling through wood and wire. A smell darker than rice, sharper than barley. She wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders, bracing herself. The guards stepped in. Heavy pitchers clanged onto tables. Tin cups rattled in their hands. Steam curled upward like banners of surrender. The liquid poured again, blacker than night, glimmering with an oily sheen. The memory of yesterday rushed back, gagging, coughing, the sound of women spitting into the dirt. No one reached for the cups. The room filled with the silence of suspicion. Then, the guards carried something else. A tray, stacked with small white packets, each one folded tight, no larger than a finger. They dropped them onto the tables as if scattering playing cards. Keiko picked one up cautiously. She turned it over in her hand, listening to the faint rattle inside. White powder? Medicine? Poison? The guard saw her doubt. He tore one open himself, poured the contents into his own mug, stirred with a spoon, and raised the drink to his lips. He sighed, smiling, as if the bitterness had melted away. "Sugar," he said slowly in English. The women looked at one another. None moved at first. The memory of quinine, of bitter powders and sharp injections, still haunted them. In Japan, medicine was never sweet. To think of sweetness inside this black poison felt impossible. But hunger pushed courage forward. One prisoner tore the packet, letting white grains spill into her cup. They dissolved instantly, disappearing into the darkness like snow into fire. She stirred, hesitated, and sipped. Her face softened. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. She nodded, almost shyly. "Amai," she whispered. "Sweet." The word broke the silence. Others tore open their packets. Spoons clinked. Laughter rippled, uneasy at first, then freer as each sip proved less violent than the last. Keiko tried it herself. The difference startled her. The bitterness was still there, but dulled, cushioned, turned from punishment into something tolerable. It no longer felt like poison. It felt like endurance, disguised in sweetness. For the first time since capture, she let herself laugh. Outside, the camp bustled with routine. American soldiers lined up in the mess hall, each man with a mug in hand. They gulped boiling coffee between bites of eggs and toast, some pouring it over ice, others carrying it to the guard towers where night still clung. Coffee was not luxury. It was ritual. It woke men for dawn raids. It carried them through sleepless nights. It steadied their hands before combat. General Eisenhower himself had once said coffee was indispensable. Supply officers measured it with the same seriousness as ammunition. In 1945 alone, America shipped more than 140,000 tons to its troops, enough to stretch freight trains from New York to Chicago. For Americans, coffee was life. For the Japanese prisoners, coffee was still mystery. Keiko stared into her cup. She remembered her father's voice in Osaka, warning that too much coffee made the heart race. She remembered her mother brewing roasted barley tea, the nutty aroma filling their small kitchen. Tea soothed. Coffee assaulted. Tea whispered. Coffee shouted. Yet here she was, sipping the drink she had sworn was poison. Her stomach clenched, but her chest warmed. For a brief moment, the barbed wire seemed farther away. The women whispered to one another, "Maybe it is a test. Maybe they want us to grow addicted. Maybe it is punishment, hidden in sweetness." Suspicion lived side by side with laughter. Each sip carried both. The guard leaned against the doorframe watching them. He raised his mug in salute. For him, it was nothing. For them, it was a revolution. That morning marked a shift. Yesterday had been confrontation, tongues gagging on bitterness. Today was transformation. Sweetness dissolving fear. But confusion lingered. Why did Americans drink this daily? Why did they seem stronger afterward? How could something so bitter be joy? Keiko thought of the guards' moods. They barked before breakfast. They softened afterward. Was this their secret? Was this the medicine that gave them energy, patience, endurance? The thought frightened her more than the drink itself. Numbers whispered the truth. A single American division of 15,000 men consumed more than 250,000 cups each day. Multiply that by the millions under arms and the figures became rivers. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped more than 1.5 million pounds every week, enough to fill 30 Liberty ships in a year. Japan could not dream of such abundance. Its soldiers marched on rice and barley. Its sailors sipped tea, if leaves could be found. Even officers received coffee only in rare doses, prescribed like medicine. Scarcity was their rhythm. Abundance was America's. Keiko lowered her cup and stared at the last grains of sugar swirling at the bottom. She realized she was not just drinking a foreign liquid. She was tasting the system that had beaten her nation. She whispered to herself, "Perhaps victory tastes like this." The third morning arrived with routine. Boots scraped, doors clanged, steam rose. But this time the women no longer looked at the pitchers with dread. They sat upright, expectant, as if bracing for a ritual they could not resist. The first day had been shock. The second, confusion. Now came something new. Habit. Keiko cupped her tin mug differently. No longer holding it at arm's length like a vial of poison, she brought it close, cradling it almost the way she had once held a bowl of tea in her mother's kitchen. The liquid still looked like ink, but the smell no longer cut like a knife. It had become familiar, even comforting in its regularity. Sugar packets rustled across the tables. Hands tore them open without hesitation. Spoons rattled, laughter spilled, and for a brief moment the barracks sounded like a marketplace. Women whispered comparisons. "It tastes like chewing tree bark." "Yes, but sweet bark now. Like candy medicine." Giggles spread quickly. The camp for a moment felt less like a cage and more like a village gathering. A guard leaned on the doorframe, mug in hand. He tilted his head and asked in broken Japanese, "Coffee good?" Some nodded, others smiled shyly. He raised his mug in salute. For one heartbeat, the wire between captor and captive blurred into steam. Keiko sipped slowly. The bitterness was still sharp, but it no longer felt like punishment. Her body accepted it. Her chest warmed. Her mind steadied. She realized that something inside her had shifted. What she had once spat out with disgust, she now craved, against her will. At night, lying on her bunk, she found herself waiting for it. She whispered to herself, ashamed, "I am a prisoner, and I wait for their gift." Other women confessed the same. "It makes me less tired. I feel less hollow afterward. Perhaps this is why Americans never stop." The thought was dangerous, but none denied it. They had begun to connect the drink not with poison, but with endurance. Outside the wire, the evidence was everywhere. American soldiers marched to duty with mugs in hand, sipping between commands. Guards carried cups into watchtowers, keeping themselves awake through endless shifts. In the mess halls, mugs lined the tables like rifles, each one filled before orders were given. Coffee was not indulgence, it was oxygen. A single division of 15,000 men required 250,000 cups every day. Multiply that by armies spread across the Pacific, and the numbers became rivers. Historians would later calculate that the United States shipped more coffee during 4 years of war than Japan had imported in half a century. Abundance itself had become a weapon. Keiko thought of Japan. She remembered her mother stretching barley into tea, steeping the same leaves twice, even 3 times, until the flavor faded into hot water. She remembered her brother, weakened by hunger long before bombs ever fell. She remembered neighbors boiling roots, chewing grass. Scarcity had defined her nation. Abundance now defined her captors. Even in captivity, she tasted more than she ever had in freedom. The paradox cut deep. Free at home, she had starved. Imprisoned abroad, she drank coffee with sugar. The women began to notice patterns. Guards shouted before breakfast, then softened afterward. Fatigue lined their faces until the mugs arrived, then lifted like mist. Laughter spread among them as easily as it did in the barracks. One prisoner whispered, "Perhaps it is their medicine of kindness." Another answered, "Perhaps it is why they won." The thought frightened them, but the evidence surrounded them. In Washington, generals calculated campaigns not only in bullets, but in beans. One logistics officer boasted that every soldier received at least 3 cups daily. Supply convoys carried sacks of coffee across submarine-infested waters with the same priority as ammunition. A single Liberty ship could supply an entire division for months. By contrast, Japan's supply chain staggered. No colonies produced beans in bulk. No convoys came from Brazil or Colombia. Under blockade, imports collapsed. Coffee became rumor, a ghost drink reserved for officers, diplomats, or doctors prescribing it as stimulant. The imbalance was not only economic, it was cultural. America fought wars with abundance. Japan fought them with sacrifice. Keiko stared into her mug. The sweetness still lingered on her tongue. She thought of her father's warning that coffee made the heart race. She thought of her mother's soft barley tea. She thought of her brother who never lived to taste either again. She realized she was not only drinking a foreign liquid, she was drinking proof. Proof that America's rivers of supply reached farther than Japan's spirit could endure. Proof that victory was measured not only in steel and fire, but in cups served even to enemies. One translator explained it best. The women had asked him, "Why do Americans drink medicine every morning?" He smiled and answered, "For us, it is not medicine. It is morning itself." The words stunned them. Morning itself? Could a liquid define the start of a day, a rhythm of a nation, a heartbeat of an empire? They realized it could. For America, the day did not begin with the emperor's voice or the sound of drums. It began with coffee, poured into millions of cups at once. That week, the barracks changed. Silence no longer ruled the mornings. Instead came the tearing of sugar packets, the clinking of spoons, the low hum of chatter. Guards no longer forced cups into reluctant hands. Women reached for them willingly, some even asking for more sugar. Habit had replaced suspicion. Captivity had turned fear into routine. At night, Keiko lay awake, uneasy with the change. She whispered into her diary, "We thought it was poison. Now we drink it gladly. Does this mean we are losing again, even in captivity?" Her hand trembled as she wrote, but she did not stop. She understood now what defeat tasted like. It was not only bitter, it was sweetened bitterness, swallowed each morning with laughter that felt foreign on her lips. The paradox deepened. In Japanese camps across Asia, Allied prisoners starved on bowls of watery rice. They drank barley water, if they drank anything at all. Men wasted away by the thousands, their bodies thinned to shadows. And here, in America, Japanese women stirred sugar into black liquid each dawn. They laughed, they coughed, they whispered jokes. They survived not only with food, but with something their own army had never given them. The humiliation burned, but the warmth spread. For some, coffee became the enemy's weapon. For others, it became survival. Keiko realized something she could not admit aloud. Each morning she waited for the smell. It gave the day shape. It carved beginnings out of monotony. In captivity, time blurred, but coffee cut it into pieces. She hated the thought, but she could not deny it. She had become dependent on the enemy's gift, and so what began as gagging turned into sipping. What began as suspicion turned into ritual. What began as defeat turned into endurance. The Americans had won battles with guns, but in the barracks of Hawaii, they were winning mornings with cups. Winter 1945, Wisconsin. Snow pressed high against the wire fences, turning barbs into white lines of silence. Inside the barracks, stoves rattled with heat. Guards stomped frost from their boots, and on every table steam rose from tin cups. Coffee. Again. By now no one was surprised. The pitchers arrived with such certainty that the women measured mornings by the hiss of boiling water. The bitterness still lingered, but the sugar softened it, and in its predictability the drink carried a strange weight. Captivity marked not by chains, but by cups. Keiko sat with her back against the wooden wall, watching the steam curl upward. She remembered her first gagging sip in Hawaii, the suspicion that it was poison. Now she stirred automatically, listening to the clink of spoons, the low chatter of women comparing sweetness. But this morning, something else arrived. A man with a camera. The guard opened the door wide and ushered him in. His lens glinted as he pointed it toward the tables. The translator followed, calling out in Japanese, "Lift the cups, smile." The women froze. Why smile? Why lift the very liquid that had once felt like punishment? But hesitation turned quickly to obedience. Slowly, they raised the mugs, steam rising between faces and glass. The shutter clicked. The moment was captured. Photographs like this traveled farther than the prisoners ever would. They appeared in American newspapers under captions, "Prisoners receive humane treatment under the Geneva Convention." To families back home, the images were reassurance. To the wider world, they were proof. The proof was simple. Even enemies drank the same coffee as American soldiers. Keiko watched the cameraman move around the room, snapping angles of women sipping, some smiling faintly, others staring into cups. She whispered to her neighbor, "Why show this? Why photograph bitterness?" The neighbor whispered back, "Because it makes them look kind." Another added, "Because in Japan, no one would ever believe it." The irony was cruel. On the other side of the Pacific, Allied prisoners starved in Japanese camps. They chewed grass, swallowed gruel that barely filled the stomach, drank barley tea only on lucky days. Coffee was unimaginable. For them, mornings began with emptiness. But here, in America, Japanese prisoners stirred sugar into mugs and posed for photographs. The difference was not only survival, it was propaganda. The Red Cross arrived, too. Inspectors in heavy coats walked the halls, notebooks in hand. They checked meals, spoke to prisoners, compared rations. Again and again, their reports carried the same phrase: rations equal to those of U.S. soldiers. Coffee served daily, with sugar and milk when available. For the women inside, each question felt strange. "Do you receive coffee every day?" the inspector asked. They answered yes. He smiled, nodded, and scribbled. For him, it was a line of data. For them, it was testimony written into history. Keiko saw the pattern. Every cup was more than nourishment. It was evidence. It told the world that America could afford to serve luxuries even to its enemies. That America's warehouses were so full that even behind barbed wire captives could taste abundance. She thought of Osaka, where neighbors traded heirlooms for a handful of rice. She thought of her brother, lost to hunger before the bombs. The paradox cut deeper each morning. Free at home, she had starved, but as a prisoner, she drank coffee with sugar. The guards themselves joked about it. "Sometimes I think the prisoners eat better than we do," one muttered. It wasn't entirely true. Rations were nearly identical, but the comment carried a point. The flow of supplies never faltered. Barrels of flour rolled into storerooms, crates of canned peaches stacked high, sacks of coffee piled taller than a man. Scarcity marked Japan. Abundance marked America. And abundance was louder than guns. Photographs of steaming mugs became tools of war. Posters circulated showing POWs in clean uniforms, holding bread, smoking cigarettes, sipping coffee. The captions declared, "This is how America treats its enemies." The message cut two ways. To American families, it was comfort. Maybe their own sons in Axis hands might be treated the same. To the wider world, it was dominance. Only a nation drowning in resources could afford to serve coffee to enemies without hesitation. Keiko remembered one afternoon when the camera returned. The translator urged them again, "Lift your cups. Smile." Some resisted, but the guards coaxed them gently. She lifted hers too, steam clouding the lens. The shutter froze the moment. To America, it was an image of benevolence. To her, it was humiliation disguised as hospitality. The Red Cross reinforced it. Reports sent to Geneva contrasted American camps with Japanese ones. They noted not only calories, but comforts: bread, butter, cigarettes, and always coffee. Historians later studied these documents and realized coffee itself became a measure of morality, where one side starved prisoners, the other gave them sugar. The difference was sharper than steel. It was written in calories and cups. Keiko carried that weight every time she stirred. She remembered her father cutting barley into meals, her mother stretching leaves to make tea last longer. She thought of neighbors boiling weeds, and here she was, tasting what she once thought was poison, drinking what her people had never received. Every sip was a reminder. Japan had lost not only in battlefields, but in storerooms. The war was decided not only in skies, but in cups. One day, as she lifted her mug for the camera, she realized something she would never forget. Guns may have ended the war, but coffee explained it. By the 5th week, the camp had its own rhythm. The mornings no longer began with boots or orders. They began with the smell of boiling coffee drifting through the wooden halls. The women stirred before the guards arrived. They sat upright, hair still tangled from sleep, waiting for the clink of pitchers against tables. It was not hope. It was not joy. It was something stranger: expectation. Keiko noticed the change in herself first. The bitterness had once filled her with dread. Now her body demanded it. When the smell was late, her head ached, her mouth grew dry. She hated the feeling, hated herself for longing, but she could not stop it. She wrote in her diary, "I am ashamed. I wait for their drink, as if I were one of them. Is this what defeat tastes like? To desire the enemy's gift?" Around her, women whispered the same. "It keeps me awake. My hands do not shake after it. I feel less weak." The realization frightened them. What had begun as punishment had become fuel. The line between resistance and acceptance blurred. The guards noticed too. They teased gently, setting mugs down with mock bows. "Breakfast," they said in broken Japanese. The women frowned, but none refused the cups. Some even smiled as they stirred. It was the cruelest paradox. They hated their captors, yet relied on their cups. The barbed wire held their bodies, but coffee held their mornings. Outside the wire, America's obsession deepened. In Europe, GIs brewed coffee in foxholes, pouring powder into helmets when canteen cups broke. In the Pacific, sailors carried giant urns to the decks, filling tin mugs through night watches. In hospitals, nurses revived wounded men with sugar and caffeine before morphine arrived. One statistic explained it all. By 1945, American troops consumed more than 250,000 cups every hour of every day, enough to keep an entire nation of soldiers awake, alert, alive. The Japanese prisoners could not ignore the truth. Coffee was not indulgence. It was energy itself. Keiko whispered one morning, "This is their rice." The others nodded. In Japan, rice was survival. Without it, no day could begin. Without it, soldiers collapsed. In America, coffee played the same role. Without it, soldiers faltered. Without it, mornings did not exist. The thought unsettled them, but they could not deny its clarity. Days blurred into weeks. Seasons shifted outside the wire. Snow melted into mud, mud baked into dust. But inside the barracks, the ritual never changed. The guards poured, the women stirred, the mugs lifted. Some began to experiment. They asked for more sugar, trading favors or scraps of bread to get extra packets. Others tried to sip slowly, stretching the warmth across an hour, as if holding on to comfort in a place where comfort was rationed. The act itself became survival. A bitter liquid softened into a daily anchor. Keiko caught herself laughing one morning, the cup halfway to her lips. The sound startled her. She looked around, embarrassed. But the others were laughing too. A small joke had sparked across the tables, carried by steam and spoons. For a heartbeat, the barracks felt less like prison and more like memory of home. She thought, perhaps coffee is not only defeat, perhaps it is also escape. But shame followed quickly. At night she lay awake, replaying the laughter. Was it betrayal? To enjoy the enemy's drink? To let it soften the barbed wire even for a moment? She remembered propaganda from Tokyo. Americans were monsters, without honor, without soul. Yet here she was, clinging to their sugar packets like treasures. Defeat was no longer only military. It was internal. Every sip carved doubt deeper into her identity. The paradox defined the camp. On one side of the ocean, Allied POWs in Japanese hands wasted away, denied even rice. On this side, Japanese women stirred sweetness into bitterness, surviving each morning with cups. Letters smuggled home told the story. "They give us coffee every day," one woman wrote. "I do not know if it is kindness or cruelty. It makes us laugh, but it also makes us forget." The Red Cross continued to visit, recording rations, noting calories. Their reports used numbers, but behind those numbers lived contradictions. One inspector noted, "Morale appears higher than expected, perhaps due to availability of coffee and sugar." To bureaucrats, it was a detail. To Keiko, it was a confession. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she sat outside the barrack with her empty mug. The air smelled of earth and smoke. She turned the cup over in her hands, staring at the stains inside. It struck her then. This tin mug had become her diary. Each line of residue marked another morning survived. Each grain of sugar, another compromise swallowed. She whispered, "I drink their power, and in return, I remain alive. Does that mean I am theirs?" The question hung heavier than the wire around her. Coffee had become more than a drink. It was rhythm. It was survival. It was surrender, disguised as sweetness. By spring, the women no longer called it medicine. They no longer spit, no longer coughed, no longer hesitated. They drank, laughed, waited for the warmth. The ritual that had begun with fear had become their anchor, and in that anchor lived both humiliation and hope. By summer 1946, the camp breathed with routine. Every morning, the same ritual unfolded. Boots on gravel, doors creaking open, pitchers steaming, cups clinking. But by then, coffee was no longer alien. It had become invisible, like the wire itself, always there, shaping every breath. Keiko realized the change slowly. She no longer gagged. She no longer questioned. She drank the cup each morning without thinking, as naturally as she once drank barley tea at home. One morning she caught herself humming as she stirred. A simple tune from childhood, a song her mother sang while pouring tea. She froze when she noticed, ashamed. But the truth was undeniable. Coffee had taken tea's place. "I begin my day with it now," she whispered to her neighbor. "Does that mean I am American?" The neighbor laughed softly. "No, it means you are alive." The paradox deepened with every sip. Japan had taught her that strength came from sacrifice, from silence, from enduring hunger without complaint. America showed her that strength could come from indulgence, from sugar, from abundance, from cups that never ran dry. It was not just two nations clashing. It was two worlds. In America, coffee meant democracy in a cup. Generals drank it. Privates drank it. Nurses, farmers, politicians, all carried mugs. It was the one ritual shared across every rank, every class. Historians later wrote that during the war, the U.S. Army distributed over 250 million pounds of coffee, enough to give every soldier, sailor, and airman 3 cups a day, every day, for 4 years. It was more than ration. It was identity. In Japan, rituals were stratified. Rice for all, but coffee only for officers, diplomats, or the wealthy in port cities. The drink divided. In America, it united. Keiko saw it in the guards. They sipped beside each other, sergeant and private, both with the same mugs. They joked as equals, once the caffeine steadied their hands. The hierarchy softened in steam. She whispered to her diary, "Perhaps this is why they win. They share, even with themselves, what we reserve only for the few." Conversations in the barracks began to change. Once, women whispered about home, about tea, about rice. Now they spoke about sugar packets, about the best way to stir, about whether coffee tasted stronger at dawn or at dusk. What began as a foreign intrusion had become a shared language. For the first time since captivity, the women felt part of something larger than themselves. Not America, not Japan, but a strange middle ground where bitterness softened into routine. The guards noticed. One joked in broken Japanese, "You drink more than me now." The women laughed, embarrassed but not denying it. Another time, an American chaplain visited the camp. He set down his Bible, poured himself a cup, and asked gently, "Do you know what this means for us?" Through the translator, he explained, "Coffee is not medicine, it is mourning. It is friendship. It is a promise that you can always begin again." The words stunned them. Begin again? Could a bitter drink carry such meaning? Keiko thought of her mother's tea ceremonies, bowls wiped carefully, leaves measured with precision, movements rehearsed over centuries. Every gesture meant respect, discipline, tradition. Tea carried memory. Coffee carried none of that. It was fast, loud, poured in metal mugs without ceremony. But perhaps that was its power. It did not look backward, it looked forward. Tea said, "Remember who you are." Coffee said, "Become something new." The Red Cross inspectors recorded more numbers, calories, rations, daily routines. They noted improvements in morale. But what they did not write was the silent cultural exchange unfolding each morning. Japanese women, raised on rituals of scarcity, were learning a ritual of abundance. The guards, raised on coffee, were teaching without knowing, one sip at a time. By late 1946, the women no longer laughed nervously when drinking. They no longer whispered about poison. They no longer hid mugs under bunks. They lifted them openly, stirred confidently, smiled at the warmth. It was more than adaptation. It was transformation. Keiko admitted the truth in her diary. "Coffee has become my anchor. I wait for it. I depend on it. I cannot imagine mornings without it now. I used to despise it. Now I feel empty if it does not come." She closed the diary, ashamed, but also relieved. For in the act of writing, she had confessed the deepest paradox. Captivity had not only bound her body, it had reshaped her senses. In those barracks, coffee was not only survival, it was revelation. It showed the prisoners that America was not just steel and fire, but sugar and steam. It showed them that victory was not only in weapons, but in warehouses. It showed them that culture could invade more silently than armies, through cups that turned poison into laughter. Keiko sat one evening watching guards sip on the porch as the sun set. She lifted her own mug, feeling the warmth seep into her hands. For the first time, she did not see an enemy in that cup. She saw a bridge between two worlds, one of scarcity, one of abundance, one of tradition, one of reinvention, one of tea, one of coffee. She whispered, Perhaps defeat is not only the end. Perhaps it is also the chance to begin again. The war ended on paper in September 1945, but for the women, captivity lasted many more months. Seasons changed. Snow melted into mud. Dust baked into heat. And still the cups arrived every morning, steam curling upward, sugar dissolving into black water. Coffee had become the rhythm of captivity, and when the day finally came to leave, the women feared something strange, that the ritual would vanish. Keiko boarded the transport ship with a bundle of clothes and her diary. She expected silence, the smell of salt and iron. But the galley below deck still boiled with the same bitter steam. American sailors carried mugs, sipping between orders, laughing as if war had never existed. She inhaled sharply. Even leaving captivity, she could not leave the smell behind. Weeks later, she stepped onto Japanese soil again. The sight was unbearable. Cities lay in ruins. Tokyo smoldered still, Hiroshima scarred beyond comprehension. Streets once crowded with tea houses and market stalls had turned to ash and rubble. And yet, through the wreckage, a new smell floated. Not the delicate aroma of green tea, not the nutty steam of barley. It was darker, sharper, coffee. American bases rose across occupied Japan. Soldiers brewed in steel pots, smoke curling into neighborhoods where families boiled roots for soup. The contrast was violent. One world steeped in starvation, the other in abundance. Children gathered near fences, sniffing the air, begging for scraps. Sometimes guards tossed sugar cubes through wire, laughing as kids scrambled. Sometimes they poured coffee into tin cans and slid them across. For the Japanese, the smell became inseparable from occupation itself. The bitterness of defeat carried on the wind in every street near a base. Keiko walked through Osaka, her hometown. She passed neighbors chewing millet, mothers stretching meager rice rations. Yet at the train station, an American canteen served soldiers steaming mugs. Civilians stared at the liquid with suspicion and envy. She whispered to herself, "Even here, it follows me." In the years before the war, coffee had been rare. Small cafes in Kobe or Yokohama served it to wealthy travelers, importing beans at a cost only the elite could afford. Most Japanese had never seen it, let alone tasted it. After the war, the equation inverted. Coffee became everywhere visible. Not because Japan produced it, but because America flooded the land with its rituals. Occupation forces imported thousands of tons annually, filling not only their own mugs but also seeping into Japanese streets. The bitter drink became a symbol, not of luxury, not of medicine, but of defeat. Keiko sat in her family's rebuilt kitchen months later. The walls were bare, the cupboards nearly empty. Her mother brewed barley tea in a cracked pot. The aroma filled the room with memory, but Keiko felt a hollowness. She whispered, "It smells weak." Her mother frowned. "Weak? This is what we always drank." Keiko nodded, ashamed. But in her mind, barley tea no longer tasted of strength. It tasted of scarcity. She realized she missed the bitterness she once despised. In Tokyo, black markets grew. Coffee appeared in tins smuggled from U.S. depots, sold at impossible prices. A single pound cost more than a week's wages, and yet customers came. Former soldiers, students, even housewives traded heirlooms for a chance to taste the forbidden drink of victory. Cafes reopened among the ruins, serving watery cups to crowds who craved not the flavor, but the association. To sip coffee was to touch the modern, the foreign, the victorious. Historians later called it the coffee wave. Between 1946 and 1950, imports soared under American supervision. While rice remained scarce, coffee flowed steadily into ports. In numbers, the contrast was stark. The average Japanese family survived on fewer than 1,800 calories per day. American soldiers consumed nearly double, and always with coffee included. Abundance spoke louder than words. For every Japanese who sipped barley tea, there was an American nearby lifting a mug of coffee. Keiko wrote in her diary, "At home, tea feels like the past. Coffee feels like the future. But the future is not ours. It belongs to them." Her pen stopped. She stared at the ink blot spreading across the page, dark as the liquid she could not forget. For many women, the memory of captivity carried bitterness beyond the drink itself. Some could never touch coffee again without tasting humiliation. Others embraced it secretly, whispering that it had kept them alive when nothing else did. One prisoner later recalled in an interview, "I hated them, but I waited for that smell each morning. It made me believe I would live another day." America understood the symbolism too. In magazines, photographs showed Japanese civilians sipping coffee in newly opened cafes, smiling under neon signs. The captions read, "Japan learns democracy, one cup at a time." It was propaganda again, but also reality. The drink had leapt from prison barracks to entire cities, carried not by force, but by taste. Keiko sat in one of those cafes years later, the walls painted bright, the furniture Western. She lifted a porcelain cup, not tin. The coffee was weak, the sugar scarce, but the symbolism overwhelming. Around her, students read English newspapers. Jazz drifted from a gramophone. She whispered, "This is not Japan as I knew it." And yet, she sipped. The paradox lived on. What began as suspicion had become routine. What began as punishment had become survival. What began as humiliation had become the foundation of a new culture. Coffee was no longer medicine. It was no longer poison. It was no longer only the enemy's gift. It was the taste of a Japan that had lost, and yet, in losing, was being remade. The 1950s came with speed. Factories rose where ruins had stood. Trains roared again across scorched bridges. Neon lit the night streets of Tokyo, and through all of it, the same smell followed. Bitter, sharp, unmistakable coffee. At first it was still foreign, still tied to memory of defeat, of wire fences, of guards laughing over steaming mugs. But America's presence in Japan did not vanish with surrender. It deepened. Bases sprawled across the islands. Soldiers crowded into port cities. And wherever they went, the scent of coffee traveled with them. Keiko smelled it again in Osaka Station in 1951. She had returned to civilian life, working as a clerk. One morning, rushing to the train, she stopped short. A kiosk sold paper cups filled with dark liquid. The sign read in bold letters, "Coffee, hot, 10 yen." She froze. The steam curled upward, just as it had in the barracks. For a moment, the noise of the station fell away. She was back behind wire, a prisoner with a tin cup, sugar dissolving into bitterness. She almost walked past, but something stronger pulled her back. She paid the coins, lifted the paper cup, and sipped. It was weak, watered down. Nothing like the mugs the guards had poured. But it was coffee, and in that sip, she realized the taste of captivity had become the taste of her country's future. By mid-decade, Japan's economy leaned heavily on American imports. Wheat, sugar, and above all coffee poured through Yokohama and Kobe. Trade statistics showed it clearly. Coffee imports multiplied tenfold between 1947 and 1955. The numbers seemed unbelievable for a nation that had once called it medicine, rumor, poison. But the truth was simple. Coffee had become a symbol of modernity. To sip it was to look forward, not backward. To sip it was to signal you belonged to a new Japan, tied less to tea ceremonies and more to the hum of American jazz drifting from Ginza cafes. The cafes themselves exploded in number. In Tokyo alone, more than 600 opened by 1955. Students crowded them, listening to vinyl records, reading translated novels, sketching notes on napkins. Coffee was not just drink. It was atmosphere, ideology, rebellion. Posters outside promised a taste of America in every cup. Young men in second-hand suits and young women in Western skirts filled the tables, sipping from porcelain instead of tin. They spoke of democracy, of opportunity, of rebuilding. And yet, behind every laugh, the shadow lingered. The women who had once been prisoners sat quietly, watching youth embrace what they had first known as humiliation. Keiko met two former fellow prisoners in a cafe in Kyoto in 1954. They sat at a corner table, steam curling between them. At first, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than the aroma. Then one of them whispered, "Do you remember the sugar packets?" The others laughed, softly, almost with tears. They remembered, the guards smiling, the spoons clinking, the shame of waiting for the enemy's drink. Keiko lifted her cup. "Now it is everywhere," she said. Her friend nodded. "And still, I cannot hate it." They drank in silence, the past and present folded into the same sip. Numbers again told the story. By 1955, Japan imported over 40,000 tons of coffee beans annually, enough to give every household at least a small taste each week. By 1960, that number doubled. Economists wrote that coffee had become not just luxury, but staple. Meanwhile, tea consumption declined. Younger generations preferred the quick jolt, the urban symbol. Old traditions faded under neon lights. For Americans, this was victory without battle. Coca-Cola, chewing gum, Lucky Strikes, and coffee. These became the silent army of occupation, seeping deeper into Japanese identity than any weapon could. One magazine in New York ran the headline, "Japan Drinks Coffee, the Real Surrender." It was cruel, but not entirely false. Keiko struggled with the paradox. At home, her mother still brewed barley tea. At work, her colleagues passed around a kettle of instant coffee, each spoonful dissolving into cloudy water. She hated the taste, yet she could not refuse. It had become part of the office, part of her own mornings. She wrote in her diary, "Once I thought coffee was poison. Now it is everywhere. We build factories, we rebuild lives, and always, it is there, the smell of defeat, disguised as progress." The cafes grew bolder. Some painted their windows in English. Others filled shelves with American magazines, playing bebop records until dawn. For students, coffee became a symbol of rebellion against their parents' traditions. For businessmen, it became a sign of modernity. For women like Keiko, it remained a scar, but one she could not erase. One evening in Ginza, she watched a group of young Japanese laugh over mugs, speaking English phrases they had learned from soldiers. She realized that for them, coffee was not humiliation. It was freedom. The thought pierced her. Could the same liquid mean two opposite things at once? Historians later argued that no single commodity symbolized post-war Japan's transformation more than coffee. Rice tied the nation to its past. Tea tied it to its traditions. Coffee tied it to its conquerors, and then to its own rebirth. Keiko accepted it slowly. She still felt shame with every sip, but she also felt survival. The paradox had no resolution. She drank, she lived, she rebuilt. One day, as she walked through Osaka's rebuilt shopping district, she saw a sign glowing in neon. Coffee. Hot, sweet, strong. The smell filled the street. Crowds poured inside. She whispered, "It has won. Not just the war, but the mornings, the streets, the future." Time moved quickly after the war. The 1950s turned into the 1960s. Japan rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible. Bullet trains cut through the countryside. Neon lights covered Ginza. Tokyo prepared for the Olympics. But for those who had once been prisoners, one memory never left: the first sip of coffee. Keiko was in her 50s when she first spoke publicly. A journalist from an Osaka newspaper visited her modest apartment in 1971. He wanted memories of captivity, Stories for the generation that no longer remembered surrender. She hesitated. She thought of bombs, of wire, of humiliation. But when she began to speak, her voice circled back not to guns, but to mugs. It was bitter. We thought it was poison. Some of us spat it out. Some hid it under bunks. But the Americans smiled and drank as if it were water. Then they gave us sugar. And we laughed. I don't know why we laughed, but we did. And I realized then the war was over. We had lost. And the proof was in that cup. The journalist blinked. He had expected stories of cruelty, not coffee. But he wrote it down faithfully. In the decades that followed, more voices joined hers. At reunions of former prisoners, the story repeated. Some recalled bitterness. Some recalled laughter. Some recalled shame. But all remembered coffee. One woman said, I do not remember the faces of the guards. I do not remember the number of days. But I remember the smell of that drink. It followed me my whole life. Another confessed, when I drink coffee now, I am not in Japan. I am back in the barracks, 20 years old, holding a tin cup with shaking hands. Historians began to notice the pattern. In interviews, diaries, oral histories, coffee appeared again and again. It was more than detail, it was symbol. Professor Haruko Taya Cook, studying women's memories of the war, wrote, for many former prisoners, the first taste of coffee became the moment when Japan's defeat was no longer abstract. It was physical, swallowed, impossible to deny. By the 1980s, Japan had become one of the largest coffee markets in the world. Instant brands lined supermarket shelves. Cafes filled every district. Consumption rivaled that of Europe. And yet, for the former prisoners, each sip carried echoes of captivity. To their children, coffee was breakfast. To them, it was surrender. Keiko told her daughter once, you drink it without thinking. For me, I can never drink without remembering. Her daughter frowned. But mother, it is only coffee. Keiko smiled sadly. Yes, but it ended my war. Some refused it entirely. One woman admitted in a 1990 interview, I cannot drink it. The smell brings me back to the wire. I see guards, I hear boots. For me, tea is safety. Coffee is captivity. Others embraced it as survival. I hated them, but I waited for that smell each morning. It meant I would live another day. Without it, perhaps I would not have survived. The contradiction never resolved. Each woman carried her own truth. Numbers traced the irony. By 1990, Japan imported over 400,000 tons of coffee annually. Coffee houses flourished, from tiny kiseten in Kyoto to chains in Shibuya. The nation that once dismissed it as medicine had become the third largest consumer in the world. Victory and defeat both tasted like coffee now. Keiko attended one last reunion in 1995, 50 years after surrender. The hall was filled with gray-haired women, their voices softer but still firm. They spoke of hunger, of fear, of wire. But again and again they returned to the same detail, the cups, the steam, the laughter through bitterness. One woman raised her hand and said, for me, the war did not end with the emperor's voice. It ended with sugar dissolving into black water. The room fell silent. Then heads nodded. Everyone understood. For historians, it became clear. No weapon, no bomb, no battle etched itself so deeply into these memories as that single taste. Coffee was not battlefield, but it was proof. Proof of defeat, proof of abundance, proof of a world forever changed. Keiko, in her 80s, sat by her window with a porcelain cup. The city below buzzed with neon, trains, and crowds. She lifted the cup slowly, the steam curling upward just as it had half a century earlier. She whispered, I no longer hate it. I no longer love it, but I accept it. This is the taste of my life. She sipped. The bitterness lingered, softened by sugar. And in that moment, the war finally ended again. Half a century had passed. The camps were gone, the wire had rusted, the guard towers torn down, the barracks replaced by factories and highways. Yet the taste remained: coffee. For those who had first sipped it in captivity, the memory never left. For their children, it was breakfast. For their grandchildren, it was fashion. But for the women themselves, it was something deeper. The taste of defeat turned into the taste of survival. Historians call the 20th century the century of steel, of oil, of bombs. But for millions, it was also the century of cups. In America, coffee had fueled armies across 2 oceans, keeping men awake through battles that stretched into endless nights. Generals demanded it. Privates begged for it. Letters home swore that without coffee, victory itself was impossible. In Japan, coffee had been medicine, myth, a drink for officers only. And then, in defeat, it became a prisoner's daily ration. The irony cut like wire. The nation that had once dismissed it as foreign ended the century as one of the world's largest consumers. By 2000, Japan ranked among the top importers of coffee globally. Tokyo alone boasted thousands of cafes, from neon-lit chains to quiet kissaten hidden in alleys. Every morning, millions lifted porcelain cups without thinking. Few remembered that for some, the first sip had been through fear. Few remembered the tin mugs, the sugar packets, the nervous laughter in barracks far from home. But memory lived on in those who had been there. Keiko, in her 90s, spoke to her granddaughter one evening. The girl studied at university, carrying a paper cup of iced coffee as casually as breathing. She asked about the war, about captivity, about survival. Keiko hesitated. Then she said, "The war ended for me not with the emperor's voice, not with the bomb, not with surrender papers. It ended with sugar, dissolving into black water. It ended when laughter returned, in a place where we thought laughter had died." Her granddaughter frowned. "All from coffee?" Keiko smiled softly. "Yes, that is how memory works. A cup can hold a war." Historians later echoed the same thought. The material victory of the Allies was measured in tanks, planes, ships. But the psychological victory was measured in rations, in warehouses, in abundance so overwhelming it reached even enemy prisoners. Coffee was not listed in battle reports, but it fought every morning. It turned fatigue into alertness. It turned suspicion into routine. It turned prisoners into witnesses of a different civilization. The paradox remained forever. For some, the smell still meant captivity. For others, it meant survival. For an entire nation, it became modernization. Tea whispered tradition. Coffee shouted progress. And in the ruins of defeat, Japan listened to both voices at once. By the end of the century, Japanese companies themselves were exporting coffee culture back to the world. Canned coffee appeared in vending machines on every street corner. Brands like UCC and Boss became international. The nation that had once spat it out now sold it proudly abroad. Defeat had become identity. Humiliation had become commerce. Bitterness had become routine. Keiko's diary, preserved by her family, ended with one last line. Coffee was once poison. Then it was survival. Now it is life. I cannot separate any of these truths. She died in 2003, her last days accompanied by the smell of coffee drifting from her granddaughter's kitchen. The story closes not with guns, nor with speeches, nor with parades. It closes with a cup, because sometimes the end of a war is not written in treaties or monuments. Sometimes it is written in the taste left on the tongue. For the Japanese women who once whispered kusuri, medicine, the bitter drink revealed more than defeat. It revealed a future built not on starvation, but on abundance. And in that moment, coffee ceased to be the enemy's weapon. It became the bridge, to a world